Good morning to most, good afternoon to others, and good evening to the viewing audiences across the pond. I am your host, Jason Miles, here for another episode of This is Revolution Podcast. If you're new to the channel, thank you so much for joining us on this lovely Saturday, for me, morning. If you're a returning listener or subscriber or one of our very valued patrons, fuck yeah, so glad to have you guys back with us. As many of the patrons know, a few months ago, we launched the Crisis Papers, a kind of sort of bi-weekly-ish series of essays, mainly by me. Now, these are free to all patrons, and depending on your tier, you get the magazine layout formatted version for free as well. But if you are not a patron and would like to support this show and the writing of this show, these issues are all up for purchase as well. Wherever you are watching or listening to the show, there's a link in the description. Also, as the holiday season is well underway, what better way to say I love you to all the special people in your life than with a membership to the TIR Patreon? That's right, you can gift a Patreon membership to a loved one or to your racist aunt that says the N-word with the hardest of ours. Let me go ahead and put the QR code on the screen. As you can see in the top corner, there's a QR code. Scan that code and you can put one of the greatest stocking stuffers of all time, access to the champagne room and all the racist humor. I would also like to send a big shout out to a lady kind of known in my personal world as my other mom, Barb Scholes. Happy birthday, Barb. Send that shout out. Now, let's bring in my co-host, my homie, my dog. He is the man of the Mau Mau Hour. He is the Pascal Robert.
Peace and greens to the chat. Peace and greens to the audience. Peace and greens, Jason Miles.
Do you see what these Negroes are writing in the chat? Again and again, we didn't land on TIR. TIR landed on us. Dusty says, get her in the comment section. No, Dusty, I will not do that. No. It's bad enough my birth mother sometimes shows up in the comment section. It would be too much to get the other family in the oof. It's too much Miles family. Your family never shows up in the comments, right, Pascal?
Friends.
Wow, you made that sound real clandestine. Just some women I know. Well, let's talk a little bit about Ernest Callaway, who's a little less pimpy than Pascal, apparently. As a new anti-labor administration prepares to take office in 2025, it's critical to reflect on figures like Ernest Callaway, a labor organizer and civil rights leader who navigated one of the most volatile eras in U.S. history. Callaway's legacy reminds us of a time when the struggle for civil rights was inseparable from the fight for economic justice, and when unions played a pivotal role in advancing both causes. Unlike today, where identity politics often overshadows class struggle, Callaway and his contemporaries understood that racial and economic liberation were deeply intertwined. In an era where work is increasingly gigified and the power of organized labor is under relentless attack, Callaway's story offers a blueprint for how to confront these challenges. His ability to bridge the gap between the civil rights movement and the labor movement is especially instructive as we witness the ongoing erosion of worker protections and the growing precarity of employment. Our guest today, Paul Prescod, has written an illuminating piece in Jackman Magazine. Again, wherever you are watching or listening to the show, there is a link in the description to Paul's piece that examines Callaway's life and legacy. Together, we'll explore why Calloway's work remains relevant in understanding the intersections of race, class, and labor, and how his strategies might inform today's fight for justice. Let's welcome a sometimes why in the TIR family. And I say that because I think we all want Paul to keep his employment. Please welcome my very good friend, our very good friend, the internet's very good friend, Paul Prescod.
Great to be back. And sorry my technology gave out last time, but I'm like a 60-year-old trapped in a 33-year-old's body. So it didn't ever occur to me that I should update my software or anything. And now I've done it. I'm like, oh my God, this is amazing. I'm not used to a functioning laptop. It's amazing.
Your article mentions that Calloway was deeply influenced by his early experiences in the labor movement. How did his work with the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters shape his later activism? You write, Calloway had no patience for union leaders who ignored the plight of Black workers or civil rights leaders who downplayed economic justice.
Yeah, well, actually, I'll go back further. And actually, he wasn't with the sleeping car porters. He was with another Black rail union known as the Red Caps. They were like the baggage handlers. But I'll actually back up before then because Calloway comes from a coal mining family in Appalachia. And, in the South and in Appalachia, there was actually a lot of Black coal miners. And his father, who was a coal miner, when he was a little kid, they moved to Jenkins, Kentucky, and that's where he kind of grew up, in a coal mining town. But his father was also a miner and was a early activist in the United Mine Workers of America. And the mine workers were a very interesting union because, they were an early craft union. They were one of the few of those early craft unions that actually organized a lot of Black workers, and they were fairly egalitarian within the union. So, you're talking like the 1910s, the 1920s, the Mine Workers of America were kind of the only interracial union that actually had like some Black local officers. They would employ Black union staff to help organize. If people have seen the movie Matewan, which, covers the huge West Virginia coalfield battles, they didn't just put James Earl Jones in there because they wanted a Black guy with a cool voice. There were actually, Black miners involved in that struggle. So that's kind of what he came out of. So that's what he was born into. And coal mining, you look internationally, coal miners kind of always, no matter where they're from, tend to be pretty militant. And I think that has to do with the nature of the work. It's very dangerous. It's very brutal work. It also makes very clear class lines. There's kind of no hiding it. And especially at this time, he grew up in a coal company town where everything was owned and controlled by the coal company. So the class line was always very clear to him. And again, because it was this background, he didn't have an allergy to unions. He was used to this. His father was a coal miner. So that's what he came out of. And, his journey, he kind of wandered around a little bit. As 1934 rolled around, 1934 was a big year for many reasons, but you're into the Depression at this point. You have three major general strikes, one in San Francisco, longshore workers, one in Toledo, one in Minneapolis with Teamsters, and all of them were led by leftists of different stripes, whether it's Trotskyists, communists, Socialist Party people. But these three big militant fights this year. You also had the unemployed marches growing, and these were interracial, and had Black communists in leadership of that. So that was kind of a big year of like pushing the New Deal forward, and labor kind of breaking out and forcing the Roosevelt administration to kind of codify some more labor rights and open the door to more labor organizing. So he's kind of taking this all in as a young man. He gets involved a little bit in the NAACP, a little bit with the Urban League. This is the time that these Black organizations start caring about labor more, and they also start seeing the opening that maybe now Black workers will be allowed to be organized into these unions. So he wrote some articles for the Urban League. they set up these work councils that he got involved with. And eventually this kind of takes him to get involved in a works progress administration project and an effort to organize in these WPA programs to fight discrimination. And that's kind of his window in, and I'm actually forgetting your original question. But, you know, he eventually gets into a union called the Red Caps on the rails. These were baggage handlers. So the sleeping car porters, that was A. Philip Randolph's union. Those were the luxury train cars, the staff that waited on customers. That was one of the first all-black unions formed. So around the same time, you have the Red Caps, which is what Calloway gets involved with. He meets Willard Townsend, who was the president of that union in Chicago. Chicago is also where he first meets A. Philip Randolph. He meets Horace Clayton and sociologists like that. But he gets employed in the Red Caps at running their political education and their newsletter. And he kind of cuts his teeth there. But again, I actually forget your original question already.
That's fine. Pascal, do you want to follow up?
You know?
Yeah, one of the things I find interesting about Ernest Callaway is his ability to kind of dance between the civil rights movement and the labor movement. Can you explain how the Cold War had an effect on his ability to orchestrate union activity within the context of race and did not become a barrier until later on to his effectiveness as an organizer?
Yeah, and you know, one of the reasons I like his story and I find him so fascinating, I mean, his life kind of almost perfectly.
He reminds you of you.
I mean, that would be an arrogant statement. I mean, if I could be 1/4 of him, that would be amazing. But his life kind of perfectly tracks the rise and fall of, I mean, for lack of a better term, the labor civil rights New Deal coalition. I wish there was like a better word for it, but his life really hits on every aspect of that, whether it's labor, whether it's electoral campaigns, community organizing. He touched on all of it, and like his life followed that timeline almost to a T. I mean, he retires from the Teamsters in 1973, which is almost like, you know, the year of the oil shocks. I mean, it's kind of like the dawning of the era of neoliberalism is when he kind of retires from the union. So anyway, I mean, how the Cold War, I mean, he's also interesting, kind of similar to A. Philip Randolph and many very good socialist union leaders. He early on kind of established an anti-communist outlook. And I think what people have to realize is people like that, a lot of that was fueled by what they were seeing, how communists were organizing inside the unions. I mean, the reputation was always like, these people are taking their cues from Moscow. They're not really concerned about the U.S. situation. And the thing is, I mean, if World War II breaks out and their first stance was, you know, we're going to ally with Hitler and we were not for the war, and then all of a sudden on a dime, they turn and say, actually, no, we're pro-war. You know, you kind of start to lose credibility. And there were people who felt like, you know, when it came to black civil rights and labor, they couldn't be trusted because of these dual allegiances. So that was part of it. It's kind of a complicated thing, but he was firmly a socialist his whole life. And, you know, the CIO in the 30s was a huge moment for him, as it would be for any labor activist. I mean, this is when labor broke out as a really like radical social movement. The thing is, he realized like that window closed as the Cold War started. And especially when you get laws like Taft-Hartley, which were important because they really limited the scope of what labor could do. So you couldn't do secondary boycotts, which would allow you, you know, if there's a strike that starts one place, it could quickly explode into a bigger struggle. It kind of made labor more narrow in its scope. And, you know, you only fight for your union, do what you can do there, but you're not going to be more expansive. So, you know, he kind of recognized these limits when they came up. And when he moved to St. Louis in the late 1940s, he partnered with a guy named Harold Gibbons, also a fascinated person on his own. Without getting too much detour there, I mean, Gibbons was also a socialist, got involved in CIO organizing. He became Jimmy Hoffa's right-hand man. He was sort of like, if there was like two angels on Jimmy Hoffa's shoulder, Harold Gibbons was like the socialist on his right-hand side, trying to kind of influence Hoffa to be more, kind of like more of a social movement type of person. But they were allies. I mean, Hoffa kind of protected Gibbons from the mob taking over the Teamsters local. So Gibbons was kind of able to carve out in St. Louis this local that was still very radical, still very militant. And they started to pioneer social programs. So they had started a health institute for their own workers. And he started getting fascinated with expanding the union's reach inside to the community. So Calloway joined him in the late 40s, and they started developing this programming together. But they were always up against these structural limits that came in during the Cold War, and they kind of stood out. There weren't many other unions in the country that went as far and as radical as they did, even though, again, the whole time they maintained they weren't a communist union per se. They didn't have communists in the leadership, but they were kind of pushing the limits of what the Cold War, post-war arrangement would allow unions to do. And I think they were kind of one of the most creative situations you could look at of social movement organizing, community organizing, civil rights organizing that's kind of led by a union. And they, this partnership with the Teamsters, and then Ernest Callaway, who had one foot into Local 688 in St. Louis, but he was also president of the St. Louis NAACP. They created this really, powerful tag team that did what not many other coalitions in other cities were able to do at the time.
Is that time over, in your opinion, as far as like being able to literally infuse labor into civil rights struggles? I mean, I know that you are a labor organizer in your real life, outside of writing these articles for Jacobin and appearing on the show, but are those two different things at this point?
Yeah.
Do we have to admit that there's professional activists?
Yeah, I would say the terrain is much more complicated now. I mean, I wouldn't say it's totally over, but I think it's more difficult. And I think the tasks have changed, because I think in that era, I mean, I wouldn't say it was easier, but it was more clear what the tasks were. And it was more clear of like, we're fighting Jim Crow, which is enshrined in these specific laws. We're trying to fight for jobs to legally open for Black workers. All those kinds of things, the tasks were clear, even if they weren't necessarily easier to achieve. Mm-hmm. So now, I mean, I think post-civil rights is a different moment. And then it's also like you have these, I think which you were alluding to, all these nonprofits and NGOs that are supposed to represent civil rights interests in some kind of way, but don't really. Because, the other thing about that time, not only did you have labor, but organizations such as, with all of its flaws, the NAACP, were actually membership organizations. These members with dues sort of thing. Same thing, I believe, with like Southern Christian Leadership Council. So I think the terrain is just much different now. And of course, we have now the deluge of identity politics and how that is playing out, which you didn't have in the same way at this time. Again, the civil rights aims were kind of more tied to concrete material aims. The other thing too, which I kind of think more and more about, I think about this stuff actually, and it kind of might sound random, but in relation to the work of people like Anton Yeager, who talk about the decline of civil society. And I think that really has an impact, because just as an example, when unions like the Teamsters in St. Louis were doing these things, they were able to organize the broader community through these civil society organizations. So, for example, when Calloway became president of the St. Louis NAACP, he led this massive recruitment drive. He was able to recruit thousands of Black people in like a matter of a year. Some of that came from the union, but also, his wife was looking at Black women's clubs and got a lot of people from there. Churches, a lot of people from there. Fraternal organizations, a lot of people from there. So they were drawing on these social networks that already existed. They were kind of there for the taking, to be oriented towards politics or, working class political activity. So even now, even if you want to do that, there's just less to draw on. And I mean, it's not that there's nothing there, but you don't have you don't have an NAACP chapter with 10,000 members like you
No.
had at the time. You don't have the same amount of people going to churches. You don't have fraternal organizations that are really vibrant and active. So like they just had more to draw on to make these fights more of like a community-wide fight. So I think it's not that it's over now or there's no doing it, but I think we're almost starting from scratch in a way. We just have less to draw on in society.
Is it harder in your opinion, and this goes out to you and Pascal, is it harder in your opinion now because you have the iconography of what quote unquote struggle looks like? And the cultural winners of that are like the Black Panthers, for example.
Right.
Everybody, people, and not to discredit anything they were able to accomplish, but sometimes people put them on a pedestal a little higher than they actually were. They think the numbers of the people that were in the organization were bigger than they actually were. Um, are we kind of at a moment right now where we're so disconnected from understanding what any sort of real struggle looks like, what it's like to be part of a dues paying organization? I too read a lot of Anton Yeager. I've been trying to get him on the show. It's partially me to talk about his latest book. We've had Anton on a few times before. You remember that, Pascal? You were on those shows. The NGO, as you talked about, as you mentioned, has it displaced organized labor in a certain context when we think about trying to fight for anything?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big problem. I mean, have they displaced labor? I mean, I guess no, because at the end of the day, when it comes to economic questions, I mean, unions are still fighting for that, and they're the main ones doing that. But again, it's only covering members of these respective.
Yeah. That's that. I guess that's my point. It's only affecting.
So it's much more narrow, and of course, that has to do with the decline in union density and all this kind of stuff. I saw a statistic in an article the other day that kind of shocked me. I guess I shouldn't be surprised, but I was shocked that there are more nonprofit employees in the U.S. today than there are manufacturing employees.
Damn.
Which is, and again, I can't cite the where that came from, but it was a recent Jackman article.
I'll say this though: there's a lot of low-level jobs in nonprofits, right? Like I work for a nonprofit. If you work for any like homeless, drug outreach,
right,
all that shit's nonprofit.
Right. University is a nonprofit also.
Yeah, right. So I'd have to see how they're defining that. But even there, I mean, that's kind of a stunning statistic. So yeah, and I think there is a lack of experience of like what does this term organizing actually mean if it's being done well? And it's a term everyone uses. And what I hope to try to start to paint a picture in this article about Calloway was the things he did that were actually real organizing, what that looks like a little bit. But still, you can't glimpse that really from an article. And Adolph Reed has a great line. He always says that like people think organizing is like something that involves a bullhorn. It's really like 98% of the time that's not what it is. It's more. It's like how do you build relationships? How do you build bridges between groups and people? And like how do you network over time and find opportunities and build a base? And that's something you can't. It's not necessarily a bullhorn. So I think there is really a lack of that kind of experience over the long term, and is
that why the nonprofit is so attractive though, Paul? Is it because the nonprofit is there with the bullhorn, right?
And it's also, people look at the big moments like, okay, the mass demo after George Floyd, and again, mass demos are part of it. I mean, you had like the March on Washington, but it's like what was happening before the March on Washington is really what the important thing was. So we've had a lot of kind of explosions happen where these mass demos almost seem to come out of nowhere, but they don't really leave much afterwards. But I think people kind of look at, well, that's what organizing is like the mass demo that kind of just comes together and you're leading the chance sort of thing. But this experience of like, how do you build an organization and sustain it over time, whether it's a union, whether it's something else, or how do you use, something that was fascinating about Calloway, and I think A. Philip Randolph did the same thing with the sleeping car porters. Is like he built this union, and the union was strong in its own terms, and it delivered for its members. But then he turned that into an institutional home that could then be projected to be used for other things. And the sleeping car porters kind of was a critical home for like nurturing the early civil rights movement in the 40s and the 50s. The Teamsters in St. Louis, I mean, they use this institutional home that has people, it has some money, not a lot of money, but some money, has some resources, and turn that into this juggernaut that now could organize on local municipal issues, that could get candidates elected, all these sort of things. So I think that's kind of the task. And there's still a lot of opportunities for that. I mean, you're seeing it happen in smaller ways. I mean, you're seeing, with the new leadership in the United Auto Workers, in a pretty short amount of time, them kind of being able to take over that union and turn it into a new direction, and possibly make more waves over time. But I think that's the more interesting question of how do we do stuff like that? How do we do what Calloway was able to do, and have his hands in everything, and so we could go on more about that. But that union kind of took on every central issue that it could. But you need to have an organization to do that. You need some resources. It can't just be like scattered individuals, or it can't just be like someone on a podcast. Not that podcast.
No, you're right. I look.
And I think that's another, honestly, a big problem. And again, I'm saying this as someone, I used to do the Jackman Show, of course. I come on podcasts. I think they are important, but I think you're seeing now a generation of people who look at the leftist YouTube show as the doing of politics. And now it's like this subgenre is developing of like some certain shows, all they do is kind of talk about other shows.
Yeah.
And it's like, you realize this is not the
TMZ.
people who need to be organizing, or, this is not this doing politics per se. And I think people have kind of missed that, or like they look at almost like a podcast as a party that could like, well, this person takes a position, like they could like move votes for something, or they could like start a movement. And I think that's a huge problem.
Pascal?
I think that's a very important point, talking about how podcasts are being viewed as a replacement for actual politics. I think it's a problem that we're seeing on the left in this moment of a vacuum of actual organizing, where people are not really like going to doors or meeting in movement halls to really meet people. But one of the things that I find interesting about Ernest Callaway is that he's very persistent in that he doesn't give up in the face of the change. Particularly, how does he deal with the class? Can you talk about how he dealt with the class stratification that was ever present in the civil rights organizations like the NAACP, and how even their class politics oftentimes undermined his effort to make the movement more economically democratic in terms of its participation?
Right. Yeah, and I'll maybe start by going back a little bit back to the 40s. Another thing that Callaway saw as important with the development of the CIO, and for listeners, I probably say this every time, but if you don't know, the CIO was a new labor federation that emerged in the mid-1930s, and what made them different is they organized mass industrial workers, and they organized all workers regardless of race. So, the CIO organized in probably less than a decade, almost 500,000 Black workers. So there's a lot of Black workers in a very short amount of time. And so what Callaway saw the opportunity here was, he was thinking, and he had some early experiences with the NAACP and Urban League that weren't great, where kind of saw that these were organizations led by middle class people. Their idea was like a very narrow strategy of lobbying and of mobilization of middle class people. So he saw with the development of the CIO all these Black trade unionists, and he thought these should be the leaders of the civil rights movement. This is what the civil rights movement should look like, and it needs more people like this. And so he, in St. Louis, he confronted an NAACP that at first was more so of a middle class organization, as most of NAACP chapters were. But he kind of saw it like, similar to a union, like an NAACP, the chapter that has votes and you can vote for leadership. So he ran for that chapter president and won, and kind of went in there with a deliberate strategy of, I'm going to recruit, Black trade unionists, first from the Teamsters, but from other unions in the city. I'm going to deliberately recruit working class people to this NAACP, and we're going to change the strategy. And part of that, was not just the issues they focus on, but the strategy of, we're going to be more militant. We're going to do various kinds of mass mobilization, whether that's protests or sit-ins, but or just campaigns that are going to seek to galvanize the public instead of kind of a backroom negotiation kind of deal. And he really, he turned to St. Louis. I think the St. Louis had the second largest trade union division of NAACPs across the country. And this was actually kind of an interesting phenomenon that happened in various places where Black trade unionists would deliberately kind of go into a local NAACP chapter and take it over with trade unionists and make it more working class in its focus. So this happened in Chicago with the Black packing house workers. It happened in Detroit with auto workers. It happened in some other Midwest areas with packing house workers where, they were able to really change how the organization functioned by, an influx of working class members. So they did that in St. Louis, and, his first focus was on fair hiring and jobs for Black workers. So they kind of chose what were some of the big industries in the city that were not hiring Black workers, and doing pressure campaigns to get more Black workers in these jobs. And they had some modest successes in that, but he also was confronting kind of two problems. On one hand, he had middle class elements that didn't want him being as militant, that weren't supporting the chapter, taking these stances. Then on the other hand, he had a younger generation of people that were almost too militant, who he thought kind of wanted to just do direct action for its own sake. So that kind of became a problem in the late 60s. So he was kind of fighting that on both sides of it. But, he kind of showed it was possible that you could take a group like the NAACP and kind of substantially reform it and orient it more towards a working class base. But he was a very early observer of the fact that, the mainstream of the civil rights movement wasn't really involving working class people. And as the civil rights movement actually was successful, he kind of noticed, along with people like A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin, that it actually was serving to widen the gap between the Black middle class that was getting gains from the movement, and then the development of, and he might have been maybe one of the early people to use the term underclass in the 60s, to see what was happening as, urban areas were decaying, as, whites, but also middle class Black people were leaving cities and leaving, a class of Black people that weren't able to get employed at the same levels as jobs were leaving, as automation increased. So he was very early on to see this problem and kind of sound the alarm that they needed to deal with it. And one, we could maybe talk more about this, but one interesting fight that the Teamsters helped to lead in the late 60s was a rent strike from public housing tenants. The strike was initiated by the tenants, and then the Teamsters kind of got involved and helped the strikers, with meeting space, with strategy. They set up this tripartite alliance for housing that the Teamsters helped to run. But he kind of saw that as one good example of, like, the so-called Black underclass waging a struggle that wasn't necessarily a Black power fight, but was dealing with their material conditions. But he saw that this was going to be a growing problem of, a middle class benefiting from the civil rights movement, becoming even more disconnected from working class Black people. And if there wasn't a way to close that gap, it was just going to become a worse situation.
Pascal?
No, continue, please.
Well, Calloway was also a writer and an educator who used media to amplify his message. I kind of want to stay on the whole media point because I think it's an interesting one. How important was that strategy to his broader efforts? And how do you think this translates in this current digital age?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and this is just another thing that was interesting with him. He was a very good blend. On the one hand, like an intellectual. I mean, the Union local, the quote unquote House Utopian. So he was kind of employed as the political education director, but he kind of just did a little bit of everything. But he was kind of the guy that would dream up what the local should do and these ambitious initiatives. And he was a writer, prolific writer. I mean, it really is a joy. He has archives with the St. Louis University, which I used to write the article. So really a joy. I mean, it's kind of like a blend of like Adolph Reed, Bayard Rustin, and A. Philip Randolph as a writer and as a person. So a really great writer and intellect. But on the other hand, a very good practical organizer. Whether it came to this union, the way he built up the NAACP. I mean, he also set records in voter registration drives. He managed local electoral campaigns. Some of the first Black elected officials in St. Louis, Ernest Callaway, managed their campaign and also got the biggest vote totals of any candidate in the city. So he was kind of this blend of intellectual, but he had all the practical organizing skills in various political education. His first job again was tax unions in the 40s, and he basically ran their newsletter. And he took a very creative approach to it. Horace Clayton, who was a Black sociologist who I think co-authored Black Metropolis about Chicago in the 40s. He called it the best union newsletter for any Black union in the country. So, he was creative with it. He included cartoons, he included poems, he featured stories from rank and file members. And it was also fueled by this idea that developed more in St. Louis, which they termed total person unionism, which is really, it's a quite simple idea that, okay, workers work, but then there's 16 hours where they're not working. Mm-hmm. And we needed workers in their total capacity of human beings and think about them that way. So that kind of fueled his ideas about political education. And, he got his start what's called Brookwood Labor College. So there was kind of two big labor colleges. There was Brookwood, and then there was what is probably more famous, the Highlander Folk School. And that kind of trained a lot of activists and gave them political education. In the late 40s, he took a trip to the United Kingdom, and he had an Oxford scholarship there. And I think he went at a great moment because right after World War II, the Labour Party in the UK takes power, and that's when they institute the National Health Service. This is when they nationalize a lot of industries. This is where they have national housing. So you kind of got to see the Labour Party in the UK at its peak, and kind of got to see like this is what a really political labor movement would look like, which he always lamented we don't have in the United States. So he always had this broad view, and he always thought like, we shouldn't be thinking about workers just in the sense of like the 9 to 5, or just be educating them on the part of like what's going on in their own union. So he took that to St. Louis. He started his own, I forget, it's called the Citizen Crusader. Him and his wife put together a local newsletter about St. Louis politics. This kind of motivated their community stewards program that they developed. That's like, we want workers to be concerned about other things going on in society. That political education was always very important to him. It is interesting thinking about political education today. This is where I do think like things like podcasts and YouTube shows provide an important role. And I think we need a lot more of it inside of unions. Political education, there's like a series called Runaway Inequality, authored by Leslie Leopold, who I don't think you've had on the show, but he's worked a lot with Adolph Reed, who worked a lot with the Labor Party in the 90s. So we have things like that, but I think we need a lot more of them, of like internal political education. This is kind of where you start to see a lot of, especially blue collar union members, like half of them or more than half voting Republican or liking Republican candidates. I'm not saying political education would just magically solve that quickly, but there really is a lack of thinking about what are our broader political interests in like a more organized way. So I think today like podcasts serve a role, but I think you do need something more, or if you need an
Substantive.
organizational way
Yeah.
where it's like my union is doing this sort of thing. But I think and this is another thing interesting about like a lot of these mid 20th century labor leaders. There were so many people like this, like Calloway, like Anthony Mazzocchi, Harry Von Arsdale, who was the electrical workers president in New York City. Others, so A. Philip Randolph is one. These were, working class people, many of them who did not go to college or finish college, and were just incredibly intelligent. And the union kind of gave them the space to like display their intelligence and develop it both on the intellectual side and on the organizational side. So you see so many of these brilliant people like that who kind of, the union was their outlet. And I think we have less of that now for if you're not going to college or whatever, what is the outlet for being able to develop that intelligence and develop these kinds of like political education programs is a big problem. As like civil society shrinks, I think you're getting that problem also.
Well, Pascal, would you agree that we're kind of witnessing a bit of a paradigm shift from where we were just 4 or 5 years ago, where I think we're getting more conservative?
I think that's a very good question. I think part of the problem is that the perception is that the top down of what has traditionally been the party of the unions ideologically, the Democratic Party, is using things like saying, the white working class, the white working class. The working class is not particularly white, and trying to use them as a kind of scapegoat for the problems of electoral politics, when in reality they're using them as an excuse for their failures in addressing the material needs of working class people. And that's a problem, because it's definitely leading to electoral failures for Democrats, but it's also causing the working class to become more and more conservative and side with people like Trump.
Well, would you say that there is, again, back to kind of like the imagery that we see, like there was a moment in time that we were witnessing all these protests in the name of George Floyd, and remember the naked woman in Portland, and that was like a big deal. This woman stopped a police by taking off her clothes and being naked. Does that have the same resonance in 2024 that it does? That was almost like the flower and the gun image that you see in the 60s. Do these things have the same resonance with a working class, regardless of ethnicity, who sees maybe these actions as the whimsy of young people that have no responsibility?
I don't think they resonate the same at all in American body politic, for sure. And I do think in some ways the body politic, if not becoming more conservative, becoming more realistic in terms of what its interests are, and that looking more towards pocketbook issues as opposed to those cultural inflections.
Are they really, though? Because I disagree with that wholeheartedly, because if they did, then why would you vote for a person that definitely doesn't have your best economic interest at heart?
Because it's a perception. It's a perception to believe that
he already was in office and nobody's life got better.
Yeah, and I think, and this is where I think it's hard when talking about, especially presidential elections and interpreting voters, because we're talking about tens of millions of people. And I mean, I'm sure if you're in a room, I mean, I know I think that I could be in a room with 3 Trump voters and they're all giving me different reasons as to why they're voting for him. So I think it can get tough to be, but I do think there was a certain perception of like, I think there's a few angles to it. I think some people are just like, well, fuck it, like whatever. He's at least funny and he's at least like telling it like it is, sort of thing. Or at least he's trying. I perceive that he's trying to fight for us, sort of thing. So I think there could be a lot of things going on there. But I mean, to your question, like, yeah, I think this is something people have to like realize, like the protest iconography sort of thing. I mean, I don't think these things necessarily resonate with so-called ordinary people. That's like a loaded term I don't even like to use, but I think you know what I mean. And I don't think people are not looking at their lives like, I can't wait to be in a protest or the next protest. Now, that doesn't mean people will not protest if they don't feel they should or need to. But again, this is where it goes back to like organizing beyond like a mass demo that kind of maybe happens somewhat spontaneously. Like, just as an example, I mean, many of these union members in St. Louis that Ernest Callaway and Harold Gibbons were dealing with, I mean, there was a lot of stuff they were doing with black workers, but also with a lot of white working class union members that they were mobilizing on community issues like transit, like sewage, rat infestation, all these kinds of things. And these are the type of people who are not like, Berkeley radicals, but, if they felt that this was an issue that mattered to them and they felt that the approach taken could actually solve the issue, they would get on the picket lines, they would protest. But, it wasn't this sort of like cultural pull to do that, or it wasn't like, I want to do this because I want to be a protester. I don't think that's how most people look at these things. And I think that's something like, we have to keep in mind. Long butts. It's a lot of ways to interpret that.
There was a moment that there were a lot of people that would not have been in the streets upset and angry. And there's a lot of factors on why. But the regression to get back to like 90s level politics is frightening on how far we've tumbled so quickly. And if the solutions are supposed to be these people in the highest office, which is insane to assume that the solution is going to be the highest office in the land.
And I think, and this is kind of,
are we at a lack of, are people so desperate that they're just clinging on to whatever? Like, I'm asking the question because I don't know the answer.
Yeah, I mean, I do think there's a lot of, and on all sides. I mean, this is regarding people on the left. This is regarding maybe some people who voted for Trump. I think there is a sense of desperation and a little bit of a flailing. And I think if we're honest, I mean, yeah, sure, I have some ideas about organizing and I have some ideas about labor, but like none of us kind of really know what to do to confront everything we're confronting now and just the changed context. So I think there's a lot of flailing. And I think there's a lot of wishing of, like someone just come save the day, whether that's Trump, whether that's, and, Bernie, in the sense of, I don't think that Bernie runs represented that, but I think it does come back now in this sense of like, well, maybe Bernie now as a 79-year-old should just like keep running until he kills over. It's like, that's not really going to get us there either, as much as I thought the 2 Bernie runs were good. So I think there is like flailing for an answer, or it's like, if only the squad would do this parliamentary maneuver, if only they would do that. I've heard some people now say, and again, I can get the sentiment where it's like, look, we just need a celebrity, a left-wing celebrity, just like, Trump, he's a celebrity, and that's why he has the name recognition. That's why he can do stuff other politicians can't. Like, if only we just get our own kind of celebrity. Like, if only Jon Stewart runs in 2028. So it's kind of like constantly wishing for the Hail Mary when it's like, we got to develop a running game. We got to develop everything right now. But it is understandable, that feeling of desperation. And this is also like, well, maybe the one big protest will do it, sort of thing. Also, so there just isn't like a shortcut out of it. I mean, all these things can be part of it. Protests can be part of it. Electoral campaigns can be part of it. And again, this kind of gets me back to Calloway. He was someone. Part of why I admire him is he kind of blended the radical and the pragmatic in a way, because he never kind of gave up on his radical politics and what he was pushing for, but that didn't negate the idea that, I think running for office is important. Having more Black elected officials has something to play in this thing that we're doing here, but it's not everything. So I think he kind of had this well-rounded approach that is probably still relevant today. I don't think there's going to be one kind of silver bullet out of this mess that we're in.
Pascal?
Yeah, in this current kind of gig economy, one of the things that we find interesting with the union levels being so low is that it's the difficulty in organizing people in this time. What kind of tactics do you think Callaway would use to organize and mobilize the working class in this environment?
Yeah. And you know, when he retired from the Union in 1973, he became a lecturer at St. Louis University, and he still continued to write. And his writings during the 70s were really interesting also because he really foresaw the future and he kind of could see the problems coming for labor. And he also named that, you know, the economy is changing, there's deindustrialization. He also kind of saw that labor had to figure out how to organize small and medium-sized firms because there's more of those now. So, I mean, how would he deal with this? I mean, I think he would, for the unions that do exist, I mean, I think he would see that they're going to have, you know, they would have to figure out a way to turn their union structures into things that could mobilize people who are not in the union as well. And try to be able to build ties, even though all these things are now smaller now. It's not like no one goes to church anymore. It's not like there's no civic organization. So, like, I think he would be thinking about, for the unions that do exist, how do you, in your area, whether you're in a city or a town, figure out how can your union build ties with these other social networks and work with them, these people, on concrete issues that matter in their lives. I think he would also probably be thinking about something that's kind of interesting with the unions that do exist right now. They actually have a lot of money. There's been some articles written on this, like a lot of money. And, you know, it's tempting to say, like, well, they're just conservative sellouts. Why aren't they spending all this money on trying to organize more workers? And I do think part of it makes sense of why they have felt the need to be conservative because the terrain is so tough. And it has been so hard to organize new workers, even when you do throw resources into it. But that's kind of been the mindset. So having said all that, I do think there is a need to, especially right now, we're in a certain moment where, despite how bad everything is, public opinion of labor is high. I think a lot of workers actually want unions. I mean, I can just tell you from a lot of Teamsters that I work with, like local leaderships and staff and things like that, they were saying, you know, these last few years, there are more leads than they can keep up with right now. Whereas 10 years ago, they were fishing for leads, for organizing leads. But right now, there's a lot of interest. So I think you got to look at this moment and say, this is actually a time to spend more money on resources and go big on organizing more workers. And especially now, given that we know there's likely going to be a new national labor relations board coming in soon. I think, you know, these last 4 years were a time to do that, but I think there's still room to do that again. But I think you got to recognize when you're in a moment where you could afford to put out some more resources and go bigger. I think that's kind of a moment we're in. We'll see how long it lasts, but you got to kind of be able to strike in those moments when you get them. And I think overall, I mean, he was always very creative and what the organizing he was doing. So I think, again, I think he'd be pushing the boundaries of, like, how can unions think of themselves differently? How can they kind of develop these other alliances in society and get serious? I mean, you know, the other thing is the way he did his work. You know, he had a certain seriousness in his approach that's lacking. I mean, he knew in St. Louis, he mapped out the power centers in St. Louis. Every company, you know, the business interests, the government interests, he knew the wards like the back of his hand. You know, how many voters were in each ward? Which ward was most powerful? Where were all the black voters concentrated? Like, all this kind of stuff he had mapped out. And that's like what you would have to do to be serious about doing anything in your area. He also, you know, he had the state legislature mapped out. He helped lead the first black state official was Ted McNeil, who was a sleeping car porter, a retired porter, who he helped run his campaign in 1960. So anyway, he kind of had all this stuff mapped out, and that's kind of what it would take to have a real serious analysis of what is going on right now. Where are the levers of power? You know, where is our leverage? There kind of has to be more of that.
Pascal, sorry.
Yeah, no problem. One of the things I find interesting about him that I actually like is he takes on a legacy congressional Black Caucus family that has been the bane of Black politics for years, the William Clay, the Clay family.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about his role in seeing the birth of that horrible dynasty that eventually Cori Bush had to take out before she was vanquished by AIPAC and others?
Vanquished.
Yeah, and that's an interesting story. And also, I mean, just shameless plug, in the next Jacobin print edition, I have an article about the Congressional Black Caucus. But yeah, William Clay Sr., the core, Congress of Racial Equality, when Calloway takes over the NAACP in the late 50s, early 60s, at first they kind of have an alliance with CORE. And CORE, was filled with these younger activists who wanted a more militant stance. And so in that time, they were kind of allied with people like Calloway, who were also taking things in that more direction. But, as time kind of wore on, again, Calloway realized like there was a segment of younger people getting more attracted to Black power who were kind of like into direct action for its own sake. Whereas he kind of thought of it in a more of an overall strategy of when and when not to use it. So, then they developed within the NAACP a youth wing. And so William Clay was a core activist in St. Louis. He eventually went into the NAACP and kind of led this youth faction against Calloway. And, it was a faction calling for more militancy, for more Black power. And Calloway kind of named him early on as an opportunist, kind of an egomaniac opportunist. And not to get too into the weeds, but Clay, kind of allied with the other labor pole of attraction in St. Louis that was opposed to the Teamsters. So the Steamfitters Union, William Clay kind of allied with them. And he became an alderman, like a city council person in St. Louis. And, he was kind of always trying to egg on these direct action protests that Calloway didn't feel were always like the most wise thing to do. So this came to a head in 1968. Calloway ran for Congress against Clay. I think it was for an open seat. And it was kind of a test case of like, the social democratic tendency represented by Calloway or the Black power tendency represented by William Clay. And even having said that, I mean, this kind of just shows you how much of the social democratic tendency came to dominate Black politics. In the 1968 congressional race, I mean, William Clay ran on a program that was like increase the minimum wage. I'm blanking now. A few other kind of various like social welfare policies that were kind of fairly similar to Calloway. But, basically at that point, Calloway realized, and through the election, I mean, I think he lost by like a 3-1 or a 4-1 margin, that, he had kind of lost his ascendancy with, especially the younger crowd. And the social democratic politics he was pushing just wasn't resonating in the same way that Clay was. And Clay was also a good, he knew how to work the ward system. He knew how to build these local alliances opportunistically usually, but he knew how to do that and got into Congress. And so William Clay was a founding member of the Congressional Black Caucus, which was founded in 1971. So, he was always high up there. And then, fast forward, Clay Jr., his son, occupied that seat until Cori Bush beat him in, I don't know, what was that, 2020, 2018? But yeah, that Clay family, that kind of goes all the way back to Calloway, and Calloway lost in the 1968 congressional election, which kind of signaled, again, that Black power was the ascendant thing at that time. And that was what was able to resonate with more Black voters. And, Clay himself was more of he was a charismatic, flashy kind of person. Calloway that wasn't his vibe. So probably played better in an election. But again, I think pretty prescient Calloway, what he thought about Clay. As he was rising up, he kind of see like this guy is an opportunist. Like, he's using Black power as a way to just signal he wants power. And, interpret Black power in the sense of like electing him as fulfilling what the Black community wants is through his own narrow interests. So it's kind of an interesting backstory there.
We look forward to hearing what you're going to say about the Congressional Black Caucus.
Yeah. Like I said, that's in the next print edition. I don't know when that's coming out. I don't know.
Print edition.
Yeah, exactly. That noise is
That's a
appropriate.
whole different thing. That's a whole different
Yeah.
police
I
structure.
don't know if they're going to have that article online for free. I mean, I'll send you all PDF if it is,
Appreciate you.
you get the, yeah.
Kind of getting back to the whole gigification of work, especially in industries like trucking, for example. How hard is it for someone like yourself to try to organize as work is becoming more and more atomized like that?
Yeah, it's hard. And the thing is, a lot of these places now, like a lot of trucking, you're designated an independent contractor. So you like legally cannot even be in a union as it stands. Now, there's been some interesting movement on that recently because the Amazon drivers, Amazon warehouse workers are employees, but Amazon drivers are deemed independent contractors. Now, the National Labor Relations Board, after the Teamsters have been pushing on this issue, and they've been in certain areas like in California, most recently actually in Atlanta, in Illinois, some other places across the country, they've kind of started organizing Amazon drivers. They kind of just declare themselves a union. And the NLRB has come out and said that that actually they are employees, that they should be designated that way because they wear an Amazon uniform, they work for Amazon, they technically work for a contractor under Amazon. So there has been some kind of progress on that. Now, sadly, the big question is can that progress be maintained under a different National Labor Relations Board? So I don't know where that's going, but this is a problem because if you're classified as an independent contractor, you just cannot be in a union legally. So
And it seems like there's more and more work that's classifying people
Right.
as independent contractors, as we saw in California with Proposition 20. I don't remember the number anymore. Is it 22, 20?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
There was actually, I'm forgetting the details, but I think in Massachusetts there was a ballot initiative around. It had to do with being able to organize Uber and Lyft drivers into
That was
something.
it was such a huge deal after they won. And I want to keep saying this so people kind of get it and understand how effed up that proposition was. Initially, it came out as an assembly bill just to recognize these people as workers. It's called Assembly Bill 5. And in the assembly bill, it said that even though they're recognized as workers, they won't be able to unionize. That was going to be the caveat that okayed everything with the gig companies. The gig companies pushed back so hard they dumped some ridiculous amount of money into a statewide proposition. I think it was like 18 million or something, maybe even more than that, into that proposition. Really started messing with the narrative that they're going to take away your autonomy. And slowly but surely, a lot of people that worked in those industries, usually like Uber drivers, they had to start doing both, like delivering food too. They saw that they were getting less money, all the benefits that they were supposed to get when this proposition ran through, they didn't get. And once that thing went through, Uber sent a email to their customers saying, not the investors, saying, we won in California. We're going to put bills like this on the ballot in these other states. So that's why I started the whole show off by saying we have an administration coming in right now that definitely is vehemently anti-labor, that won't even pretend to not be anti-labor.
Right.
And as more and more people are forced into gig work on top of regular jobs, I mean, you taught for a good amount of years. How many teachers did you know drove Uber at night? Can you even organize when everyone is so gigified? What happens if the ghouls get their wish and damn near every job is a contract position?
Right. Yeah, I mean, you can still organize. I mean, I think we should hold two things in our head. So yes, on the one hand, you're getting more and more gig work, and that's a problem. And it's like technically, legally, you can't even organize them. But at the same time, there are still many traditional work arrangements that can be organized, and there actually still is a lot of production and manufacturing and logistics workers who can be organized that still exists in this country. And, you know, we're seeing United Auto Workers are starting to make a lot of progress with non-union auto companies, electric vehicle battery companies. They just had another one in, I believe, in Kentucky, where a majority of workers filed cards to be in the union, and it's looking like they're going to win. That's about 1,000 workers there. So, you know, there still are a lot of organizing targets that are outside of the gig framework. Just a couple weeks ago, this was pretty huge. Teamsters organized 10,000 nurses in Southern Michigan in a hospital out there. So, yeah, I think we kind of need to look at both. Like, there's definitely a lot of organizing that can and should be done. But there's also, like, something needs to be figured out with the gig work and the independent contractors. And of course, it's a little bit like a chicken and an egg thing of, you know, if we're not going to get whatever, even with a Democratic trifecta, it seems like they don't have an interest in changing that. And it's like, you know, we got to organize workers to force that to happen, but it's like, how are you going to organize workers when the law?
I mean, there was a I don't know how much you were following the Uber Lyft situation in California. I don't even know if you were following either, Pascal. I think that might have been before you and I even met, but they were organizing in pretty large numbers in Southern California and even up north in the Bay Area, trying to push for some sort of recognition as being employees. And for a lot of people, that radicalized them to a certain extent. But you know, when these propositions come through and the rug gets pulled from under you, a lot of people turn extremely apathetic and you know, start looking at crypto.
Yeah, it's tough. And again, I mean, it's like I mean, just going back to this example with Amazon and how in the last 2 years specifically, they were starting to make progress with the joint employer status with these Amazon drivers. But it's one of these things where it's like, you kind of need time for that to keep developing. And it's like with a new labor board, that could all just kind of go up in smokes. I mean, I don't know for sure that will happen, but some of this stuff takes some time to develop. So it's really, you know, again, I don't really have a clear answer here. I mean, I kind of hesitate to say this because I don't see myself as an accelerationist. I also don't see myself as someone who's like, you know, the workers are just going to rise one day. But it is interesting, you know, if we look at history, the two most recent kind of explosions in organizing, you have the 30s of the CIO, where, again, I mean, we're looking at a really desperate situation for workers. I mean, maybe not a gig economy thing, but everything was stacked against them. And when it did happen, it kind of happened in this wave. And it did take a lot of workers being willing to break the law and a lot of explosive situations that kind of led to this breakthrough for when the dam broke. I mean, I mentioned 1934. You have 3 general strikes. All of them got pretty hairy. All of them involved, you know, heavy police and military repression. But a lot of it took that form going forward. And then the dam kind of broke. Other kind of period, which is less talked about, was like in the 60s with public sector workers. So for a long time with public workers, it was a law that you couldn't strike. It was a law that you couldn't be in a union. And they changed that by just saying, we're going on strike. And they were left with like, okay, I guess you can be in a union now. Like, what are we going to do? So we just, I don't know, we may be reaching a moment where it might take some kind of like like that, and more people willing to push the limits of the law to make some kind of breakthrough, because we really are at this moment where it's kind of stuck, and you know, no matter who we're electing, there really isn't like a significant breakthrough. So that just might be where we are, where it's going to take some more things like that to make a breakthrough. But I don't know. I'm not sitting here saying that's going to happen for sure. But you know, it is tricky to think about where we go from here. But again, like I said, there are a lot of still organizing targets that, you know, do not fit that gig framework that still can be going after. We'll probably see more of that. But yeah, the independent contractor thing is like a huge problem that we need to deal with. Yeah.
Well, Paul, I want to thank you for taking the time to hang out with us today as we're coming up on the hour. I do want to address some of the very interesting comments that people have left in various chats. DC Joe Black started it all off saying, in the beginning, there was Jacobin, and Jack had a groove. That did the house.
I like that one.
Oh God. DC says that's true. I believe true too, Jason. Most of the folks I run into here are nonprofit, if not in the government. Again, DC Joe Black, who didn't come to the DC show past now.
Wow.
Right? It's fucked up. Nonprofit industrial complex keeps winning. Sad
Word.
but true. Sad but true, Mark Owen. Thanks for shining a light on people I've never heard of. Continuing our education. This from Angelo Robles. Thank you, Andrew.
Well, there's one comment I saw you might not pick up. Someone, of course, this is like the ritual comment of white working class people vote for the right, blah, blah, blah. This, one group that did not move more towards Trump this time was union members. They were one of the few groups that actually went more to, even though, again, there's been a lot of thing about, yes, there have been polls showing, yeah, there are many union members who like Trump, but like as a whole, that was one group that actually went more for Harris this time than even 2020. Anyway, I had to get that
voted for Joy. Besides housing, tenant, labor unions, what other group activities can count as quote unquote organizing?
It's a good question. I mean, one thing I think there should be more of, and to be clear, I'm not saying this is like a silver bullet, but state level ballot initiatives. And even in this election, again, just like in 2020, a lot of these areas that went for Trump passed progressive economic ballot measures.
Minimum wage laws.
So, and part of why I think they're useful, not just for the issues themselves, but like as organizing practice, and it also provides a great opportunity to be building a very broad coalition, not just in your local area, but across the state. And in these places where it's been successful, it's involved unions working with groups like DSA, whatever the groups are. I mean, even like small business groups, sometimes there's an alignment of interests. You do stuff like door knocking, phone banking, media stuff. So I think those are, and it's good because you're dealing with an issue and not a candidate and not a party. And this is why you're seeing a state went for Trump, but voted 60-some% to tax the rich, because like there is something refreshing about being able to just talk about an issue and how it affects you and not this person, or not, well, my dad and my granddad have voted this way, so I'm voting this way. So those opportunities, I think we should take more advantage of that. When we can. I'm actually hoping to write something about the 2024 ballot measures that passed, and I think one of them actually included something around Uber drivers organizing. I have to look at the details, but especially tax the rich ballot measures, I think, are good opportunities for good organizing that builds connections.
Giving people the resources to think for their interests is definitely necessary. People are looking for answers everywhere, says Red Wizard on Twitch. Thank you very much. I protest for the long butts, says Dizzle McFizzle.
Is the apostrophe S on purpose, or is it like a double entendre thing?
Yes.
Okay.
It's everything and nothing. Think that. It's the postmodernism of butt discourse. California just had a prop proposal for heavier sentences for petty crime and drugs to make them a felony, I think. Yes, they did. It actually rolled back certain protections that California instituted in 2014. So a 10-year rollback.
And actually, one of the places that many of I think 2 or 3 progressive economic ballot measures failed in California this year. It was one of the places where a lot of them failed. So thanks.
Again, only been 4 years. People literally got elected in on the whole, I was part of the George Floyd protests. They got real quiet now. You can't fix an election cycle that took 40 years to break up long butts. Fizzle McFizzle.
Yeah. It's the long butt strategy.
It's, it's a thing that we talk about on this show. And look at Pascal, looks very upset about long butts. We need better education, propaganda, etc., that helps improve voters' class consciousness. All I heard from the Harris Group was middle class, this and that. And all I hear from you guys is working class. Hell, I barely understand what that window covers, and I did a political podcast for years. People don't understand their own self-interest enough to not vote against it, says Admiral 90-something, coming from Twitch.
I mean, yes and no. I think this thing about people not understanding their interests, I think it depends how it's framed for them and put to them. And also, when there are two bad options, it's sort of like, well, whatever. Yeah. Again, I think I don't have a scientific basis for this, but like I said, when there's 70 million people voting for a person, you're going to get a lot of different reasons from different people. But I do think there are many Trump voters that it's sort of like, do I actually think there's going to be all these improvements? No. But it's sort of like, you know what? Fuck these people. This guy, he tells it like it is sometimes. I kind of like how his vibe. Fuck it. Who else am I going to vote for? Like, I think it's more of that type of thing. And so it's like, well, are they voting against their interests? In a sense, yes. But it's like their interests are not really up on the ballot. So
yeah, like, I don't know. That's a framework I accepted at one point in my life that I don't know if I accept anymore, because I live a little, and you'll see that vote is intertwined in your interest, right? That vote to lock people up for longer periods of time. I mean, keep in mind that bill was called the Homeless Reduction and Drug Rehabilitation Act. So name alone sounds like it's something positive. Not everyone's going to understand what that bill entails fully. And if you live in a major metropolitan area, hell, there's a lot of suburban areas now that are seeing homeless encampments pop up. But as someone that comes from the Bay Area, I have to go up north often. Southern California has tons of homeless encampments. California has the most homeless people of any other state in the union. It's a glaring problem. So if a bill comes up and says they're going to reduce this, then you're probably going to want to vote for it, because it's a problem that no one likes. I've never seen anyone that enjoys homelessness. Even people that work in the industry as higher ups don't enjoy it. Right. So. And then lastly, Admiral came back. Pow, pow, pow. On the topic of unions, what can be done to save the post office? Their unions are toothless due to federal law prohibiting strikes.
Yeah, that's another. I mean, speaking of what I was just talking about things coming to a head, postal workers can't strike, but guess what they did in 1970? They broke the law and went on strike, and actually won. One good thing Biden did is he eliminated the pre-funding mandate. So some of you might know the post office was operating under a law since 2006 where they had to pre-fund their pensions 65 years in advance, which no other public or private entity had to do. So that really was the cause of a lot of financial issues. So Biden kind of got rid of that law, which was a goal for a long time. But right now they're attempting to do a reorganization to head it towards privatization. They're cutting office hours and, delivery routes and delivery times. But yeah, I mean, that's another one where it's like, technically they can't strike. I mean, theoretically they could stop it through other means. It's going to be harder now with a Republican Congress and everything. So they might have to start getting creative. I don't know. I wish I had easy answers.
Damn it, Paul. That's what you were here for. Easy answers. Fuck. Pascal, do you have the easy answers?
Not right now.
In like 25 minutes, will you?
No.
I have one. Hit like and subscribe.
There you go. Fuck yeah, that guy knows. Paul, thank you so much for hanging out with us today.
All right. Thanks for having
very good. Have a very good rest of your day.
Thank you very much.
Just for you, go Phillies. Go Eagles and go 76ers. There you go.
Well, only one of them is realistic, Eagles. So I'll take that. I've given up on the Sixers already.
The Eagles, the Saquon Barkley thing is real. So
yeah, the problem is
Mm-hmm.
I have to go, so I won't. This is my last comment. They haven't really played real teams, I will admit. So if they beat the Ravens, I don't think they can beat the Lions as of now, if I'm being honest. They can if they have a really good day and the Lions have a bad day, but we've had a winning streak against horrible teams. You got to be honest.
I don't know. Saquon Barkley is running like a man possessed.
Yeah.
That's a very good team. So again, good luck, Phillies. And Paul, take care.
All right.
Peace out. That is Paul Prescod. Thank you again for checking out the show today. Please hit the like button on your way out. If you're a new viewer, hit the subscribe notification button. If you're listening on Apple, hit subscribe and you get access to the champagne room as well. If you enjoy what we do here and have the means and feel so inclined, become a patron for as little as $3 a month or $30 for the year. You can access champagne rooms past and present. Join us for movie nights, and you make sure we can continue to bring you shows like this on TIR. Also, wherever you are listening or watching the show, there is links in the description to Paul's article in Jacobin. Pascal, do you have anything to say before we go?
No, sir.
All right. Well, on that note, we are